Okay, again from Mr. Lippman's PowerPoints, Chapter 8, the executive branch is, I guess in his book is Chapter 8, in ours it isn't. Requirements to be president. You have to be 35 years or older. You have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. You need to be a natural-born citizen. As far as how long you can be president, thanks to the 22nd Amendment, the maximum amount of time you can be president is 10 years, which is weird because you can only serve 2 full terms of 4 years each, which is 8. But the trick is to be vice president and to succeed a president who resigns or passes away or is ruled incompetent. But to do it in his last 2 years, that's the way you can get the maximum of 10 years, because you can take over for a president in the last half of his term, and then you can get elected for 2 full terms. And 2 full terms are 4 plus 4 is 8, plus up to 2 years of the term that you took over for a past president, and that gets you to 10. Impeachment. Impeachment is an issue for presidents, but only 2 presidents have been impeached. 1 resigned to avoid being impeached, but the 2 who were impeached, neither one was convicted. Line of succession. 25th Amendment explains the line of succession. The presidency was supposed to be weaker than Congress, but occasionally you have a strong president that changes things for a while, or maybe for a long time. FDR strengthened the presidency, and essentially one of the arguments is that the very size of government, the scope, the fact that it's bigger than it used to be, has increased the power of the president. So powers of the presidency. The appointment power. Over 6,000 jobs and over 1,100 require Senate approval and interim appointments. So there's a lot of high-level jobs they get to appoint. Get to make treaties, negotiate treaties. They have to be ratified or confirmed by the Senate. Can make executive agreements with other countries. These do not require the approval of the Senate, but they also cannot violate a treaty either. They do not have a line item veto. That was destroyed. The attempt to give the president the line item veto was destroyed by the Supreme Court decision in Clinton versus New York City, which basically a line item veto, remember, is where a president would have had the ability to change dollar amounts in budget bills. This was ruled unconstitutional because the Constitution explains how the veto power works and who gets to write legislation and who doesn't, and this would be massively changing the rules essentially, and the argument the Supreme Court essentially made was that to do that you would have to make an amendment, not just simply pass a law. The president has the pardon power, and the president can also make signing statements, which basically can make kind of little quasi-laws within a certain latitude. So which presidents have been impeached? Both B and D, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Nixon would have been impeached, but he resigned before they got around to it. Powers of the presidency continued. The War Powers Act is an attempt to limit the power of the president. They have not gone to to the Supreme Court on this issue, but presidents have held this act to be unconstitutional. The cabinet, the presidency, the president, going back to George Washington, started gathering advisors to help them make decisions. The cabinet now, even though it's not mentioned in the Constitution, essentially is part of the government. Patronage, the ability to get people who have done you political favors, get them jobs. To some extent, even though this has been limited by the Pendleton Civil Service Act, the president still can do this to some extent. For example, people who help elect the president might end up becoming an ambassador to a country. The Office of Management and Budget, they basically do the number crunching. They're the accountants for the president, for the executive branch. Executive orders have the effect of law without congressional approval, but again, there are certain restrictions on the executive orders. So the president is able to carry out many of his functions through the executive office of the president. Those are the president's staff, the people close to the president that help him run the rest of the administration. Can send proposals to Congress, have claimed executive privilege, which is the right to keep some secrets from Congress so that they can get advisors who will speak freely to them. Nixon tried to use executive privilege to cover up the Watergate scandal. It didn't work out for him. But there has never been a wholesale rejection of executive privilege. There seems to be an understanding that to some degree executive privilege exists, but of course presidents will try to use executive privilege for things that probably are improper once in a while. Inherent powers. Lincoln argued for the inherent powers of the executive. Basically, some things you just have to have, even if they're not mentioned in the Constitution, they're just assumed. Power of the media. Going back to Teddy Roosevelt, we have the bully pulpit with Teddy Roosevelt using the press to affect public opinion. Because the presidency is represented by one person, it is much more capable of essentially manipulating the press. And I don't mean that in a Machiavellian way, but they're able to get their message to the press in a unified voice because the president is in charge of the executive branch, whereas Congress is made up of many people with differing opinions. It's very difficult for them to use the media quite as effectively as the president can. Sometimes presidents come up with new concepts or argue for new concepts. Bush 43 came up with the term enemy combatant. Basically, these are essentially unlawful combatants. The argument is that these are guys who don't represent a soldiery. They're not part of a government. They don't fit into all our treaties, and that, he was arguing, meant that because they don't represent a legitimate government, that means that certain Geneva Accord protections that you would give to prisoners of war don't apply to enemy combatants. So what are the inherent powers of the president? Powers that can be inferred from the Constitution, but not expressly written in the Constitution. Formal constitutional powers. The president is the commander-in-chief. The president can appoint ambassadors. The president can negotiate treaties. The president can recognize nations and receive ambassadors. With few exceptions, presidents generally receive their highest approval ratings when? At the beginning of their first term. Informal powers. Things that aren't really written in the Constitution, but they can still do them. They can pass executive agreements. They can make speeches to rally the people and the troops, morale building. They can help set the agenda. When they make speeches, most people listen. When most people listen, what happens is the president has the ability to help decide what people will argue over and what policy issues people will consider. Meeting with world leaders. Crisis manager. There's 535 members of the House of Representatives and the Senate combined. They can't possibly work well in coordinated fashion in a day or two when there's a crisis. That leaves crisis management to the executive, to the presidency. Building international coalitions. Through his diplomacy powers, the president is in a unique position to go to the leaders, world leaders of other countries, and try to build coalitions. And a global leader, for all the same reasons as the reason why the president could build an international coalition. And of course, a lot of this also has to do with the ability of the United States economically to have such an enormous impact on the rest of the world. The publication of this led to the passage of the War Powers Act of 1973. The Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were classified documents that demonstrated that the Pentagon and the executive branch, the administration, the president, had been misleading Americans about the course of the Vietnam War and leaving out some of the stuff that didn't make it look like it was successful. And this led to the War Powers Act of 1973. Congress was upset to find out that they were being misled about the progress of the war.